All right. Thanks, Andres, for helping us set this up. Thanks to the philosopher for setting up so many of these kinds of discussions and giving us the chance to get to talk about really cool works of philosophy in a public setting. And thanks to Vanessa for providing a really cool work of philosophy that we
Yay.
get to talk about.
Thank you. And thank you so much for being in conversation with me about it. I'm really looking forward to this.
Absolutely. Um, I I don't know. I'm a very biased commentator because this is just straight up my alley. You know, if you had asked me 10 years ago what book I would hope to see in the world, it would be more or less this, because this is a question I've been trying to struggle with over the last few years. On the one hand, there's a deep and abiding, I think, ethical and moral impulse under the political commitment that Marxism is associated with, socialism, communism, the fight against capitalism in a particular range of forms, let's say, right? You ask people who are swimming in one of those seas what they're up to. You ask them why they're up to it, and they give you what sounds to me
Mhm.
as an analytically trained moral philosopher, like moral explanations. They think there's something wrong with capitalism. They think there's something inappropriate about the way that the system treats people. On the other hand, you have, I suppose, what you could describe as something of an orthodoxy, something of a tendency to downplay the relationship of morality, of moral theory, perhaps more fairly stated, to Marx and Marxist thought by people who are seasoned in a certain uh, set of intellectual traditions, let's say. Right. And this is the scene setting that you start the book off by noting, right? Marxists have often shied away from explicitly ethical thinking, let's say, or moralizing, as they would sometimes put it, about capitalism. There's been a sense that there's some kind of bourgeois affectation going on whenever moral thought, explicitly moral thought, enters into discussion. And your book is written in part as an answer to that perspective. It's an answer to that perspective on interpretive grounds, as a view on what it was that Marx was up to, what Marx's collaborators were up to, on descriptive grounds, as a view about what capitalism constitutively involves as a system. So, not just as an answer to how we should interpret Marx, but as an answer to how we should interpret capitalism. And then also possibly on practically substantive grounds as a sort of view of storytelling about what capitalism is about in a sense that's relevant to what we might do about it, how we might respond to it, how we might live in it. Right. So I want to make sure that the audience is aware that there are at least those three layers to what is relevant. And I'm hoping in the conversation that we'll get to some of those. And you all in the audience, hopefully you're submitting your questions to the Q&A. Maybe you have thoughts about each of those or you split them up somehow differently. But I'd love to talk about each of those. But I want to start off with just a ground clearing sort of question for you, Vanessa.
Yeah.
So what was it, in your view, that Marxists and non-Marxists felt they were achieving or avoiding by objecting to morality-laden interpretations of Marxism? And what would we achieve by leaving that interpretation behind?
Yeah, great. I mean, I take it that the thing that was that there's scientificity that Marx and Engels consider themselves to be engaging in science and to be extending a project of bringing human existence and the history of human development under the terms of the same kind of susceptibility to being known that that is relevant for other areas of science. So they'll, for example, take themselves to be doing for society and for human beings something that is coextensive with the work of natural science. But of course, the worry there is that if human existence really is knowable for the same reasons that um, objects in the natural world are knowable, namely that they're subject to some kinds of scientific law that can be ascertained and then applied in order to make predictions, that feels in tension with the idea that human beings are free, and that human life has the sort of character that can sometimes make it susceptible to moral judgment. And so I think sometimes from working within the Marxist tradition, certainly, there's a worry that that taking seriously or in some way foregrounding the ethical questions, that will be part of a movement away from the scientificity of Marxist theory, or like it's the aspects of Marxism that are most operational in giving it its explanatory power. And for those of us who think it does have quite a bit of predictive power, it's predictive power as well. So if one feels that one is forced to choose, then one chooses the scientificity, right? One chooses the economic story that Marxist theory is offering. And part of what I am doing in my book is demonstrating that we don't actually have to make this choice, that either we get the sort of scientificity of Marxist theory, or we keep ourselves in a position to be able to comment on the ethical character of capitalism, that we can do both, and that in fact much of what's going on in Marx is a attempt to make normative claims that stem from an empirical and scientific accounting of human existence.
Thank you. So I feel like what we've arrived at gets to the core of how to understand the basic elements of the project, right? So it's not just, does Marx and Marxism include this set of questions or this set of questions, but I think, as your answer reveals, really what kind of project was it in the first place, and what kind of project could it be? And I liked the way that you laid it out in the introduction to the book as well, right? You see this phrase bandied about a lot, but this was a case where really, truly what's happening is a critical reconstruction
Right.
of of Marx and Marxist thought, right? We actually need to think about this project in a different way, or we have this other opportunity to think about this project.
Mhm.
So building off of that, could you identify some specific departures where your reconstructed project maybe differs from interpretive convention, the orthodox ways of reading Marx, so we can kind of see how your view is different?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so one place to sort of get in there of course with the concept of orthodoxy, of which you yourself, right, in this question, in the former one, you note um is contested, right? Because sometimes the when I read in various kinds of analytical philosophical treatments of Marx, but not just those, any number of sort of contemporary, often liberal critiques of Marxism. The view that is presented as orthodox Marxism is not typically Karl's, right? And so that is one of the things that in trying to interpret Marx and interpret the debate and discussion about Marx, it's one of the first things to try to disentangle. To what extent is the received wisdom about quote unquote orthodox Marxism actually a reflection of what Karl Marx thought, and in which ways is it not? So, to give an example that that comes from some of my other work, but is relevant here, when we talk about an orthodox Marxist position on race and class, for example, people start enumerating all sorts of positions, none of which will you find in anywhere in Marx, right? Like the notion that somehow ideas are this mere epiphenomenon of the material base, and that therefore we don't really need to worry too much about the ideas themselves, and we just bring about the good work of proletarian revolution, and the ideas will sort themselves out as a necessary byproduct of that. This way of thinking about the relationship between matter and ideas exists nowhere in Marx's work, right? But when we think about what often is described as a kind of orthodox Marxist position on morality, we hear something similar, like, well, Marx just didn't think that normativity was real, or that that it was just sort of immaterial or didn't matter for him, that Marx had this description of human life that is completely beholden to strictly deterministic um, laws that have this kind of like mechanistic of set of operations, that such that what lies in the future is just communism, and without any question of choice or agency or the actions that human beings would have to take in order for that to come about. So in some ways I think of my project as actually quite like a kind of, what the thing I'm trying to reconstruct is an orthodox Marxist position, but with that, I mean, what was Marx's actual view? And so I have this sort of turn of phrase that I use in the introduction, and then it comes back later in the conclusion, that we see all of these attempts to reconsider, reconstruct, analyze, rethink Marx, and as I say in the book, those are often quite salutary, but my aim is what I call thinking Marx. And so while it is a project of critical reconstruction, because we don't have a place where Marx sort of sits down and says, well, here's my approach to ethics, A to Z, here it is. I am, however, trying as well as I can to um, to identify what I take to be the most significant features of Marxist method, and use those in order to present the conception of morality that emerges in the book.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you highlighted there. People are often not interpreting Marx at all, or not responding to Marx himself. They are often responding to, working backwards from slogans or vibes or things that they've heard
Mhm.
self-described
Provides,
Marxists
yeah.
say, right? And to some extent, in their defense, you can kind of understand why this might be the case. If you actually go back and read Marx, you spend hundreds of pages about corn and linen, and you're trying to work from that to what his view might be about something else. It is a little bit involved, but let's think Marx, right? As you're saying. And I want to pick up specifically on the point that you raised about the relationship between matter and ideas, right? Which is
Yeah.
a common thing that people work backwards from, and the kind of lay explanation, I suppose, of what Marx must have thought is that ideas don't matter and matter matters, right?
Right.
Why do people think that? Because Marxist philosophy is described as materialist thought. It is often counterposed with idealism. And the general thinking is that that implies some concern, not just for the world as structured by reason and thought, but by actual physical reality. And what people take that to mean in turn is a crude rejection of the importance of intellectual life or mental life. And the thought maybe that it's all guns, land, and gold at the end of the day, something like that. And this is something you pick up on later in the book. Among the many reasons to reject this crude view that you offer is a peculiar thing that Marx says in the 1844 manuscripts. And I'll read it for the audience. In the place of all physical and mental senses, there has therefore come the sheer estrangement of all these senses. The sense of having, the human being had to be reduced to this absolute poverty in order that he might yield his inner wealth to the outer world. So there's this kind of inner wealth, outer world. There's this kind of almost dualism that you might associate with different philosophical traditions in this little quote here. And you sit it next to a quote from Aristotle, Aristotle's De Anima, which Marx was apparently the first to translate to German. And I'll just read a little section of this. The primary sense organ is that in which this sort of potentiality resides. The sense organ and this potentiality are then the same, though their being is different. So it's this high level stuff about sense organs and potentials and like all the stuff that we might have thought that we were going to leave behind in a view about economies and corn and linen and exchange rates, right? So what's all this talk of sense organs and potentialities? Why would a philosopher like Marx, who usually talks about dollars and commodities, find himself in this kind of metaphysical territory?
Yeah. So there's there's numerous themes, but one of them that appears throughout Marx's writings from the early all the way to the late is this interest in the historicity of human senses. So he will speak, for example, of how the human ear becomes something more than just its biological physiology and architecture, right? That the capacity to hear is a historically produced capacity that human beings develop over the course of generations, over the historical development of music, of forms of ways of speaking, right? That the ear's sensitivity to the nuances of sound, music, communication of all kinds are ones that are given not by just its bare natural character, but by its social transformation. And same for the eye, and he will return to the metaphor of seeing, of vision, again throughout his writings, this notion of the historicity of seeing, right? And of how our capacity to make distinctions in our visual field and read the world in the rich ways that we do is one that the sort of bare natural biology of the eye presents as an abstract possibility, but it's only the history of our actual interaction and intervention with the world outside ourselves, natural and social, that produces this more fully realized activity of seeing, right, in a more nuanced and sensitive way. And he talks about this as the sort of historical development of all of our the senses we think of sight, smell, hearing, touch, and so on. And then he also speaks of a human sense And this human sense, I take it, is something that that he's also describing in places like the comment on James Mill, where Marx is describing what it would be for me to produce in a way that is unmediated by commodity exchange, and that is unalienated, and that is prompted by my immediate recognition of you and your needs, right? And my responding to those in a more spontaneous way, that is aided by this human sense, right? This sort of development of um, our our activity of perceiving other human beings and understanding them as ourselves, recognizing that we share our conditions for flourishing, and my being able to respond to people around me in that way. And this is the kind of thing that Marx thinks can only be produced by a species that has taken up the work of consciously transforming itself. For example, this is one reason why Marx is a proponent of revolution. When oftentimes it's easy, I think, to read Marx and think, well, why is he a revolutionary? Why revolution? Why is it so important, this seizure of power? And even people might assume that revolution means violence and chaos. And but for Marx, the one of the chief important uh, qualities of revolutionary activity is that it just is human beings taking up the project of approaching their own historical development in a conscious and rational way, and organizing it with a view in mind of what a better society might be, and how human beings might express and fully realize their capacity for sociality. And this also, this comes up in my book, in the chapter on what it means to talk about the abolition of morality, because I do think that Marx does in fact argue for what this abolition of morality. But to suggest that we don't need moral thinking now, or we don't need a kind of ethical conception of human beings and human development now, is premature. But what we do want is a society of people who are able to respond immediately to one another's needs, and in which the society is organized so that the realization of our capacities and the fulfillment of our needs is already what's happening. And I describe this sometimes as, if we think of moral theory as in some way a way of theorizing a gap, a space between the world as it is and the world as it should be, then if we imagine that the world might be made as it should be, right, that we might actually be able to produce that better world and live in it, and then that kind of role for morality disappears.
I want to follow up with you about that. Because the chapters immediately before that one, chapters 7 and 8, you're spending time discussing Marx's critique of kind of the standing view of morality that you were summarizing just then, right? And it has something to do with this human sense that you're talking about, I take it. But the view that Marx is objecting to is, I think, in many ways, the view that is more familiar to us now in the 21st century. The famous expositors of this kind of view of the connection between morality and politics being Locke and Rousseau, right? So both of these thinkers are concerned with characterizing humans and humanity in some essential way, and thus, in turn, human activity. For Locke, it's going to be humans' natural rights and status as the property of God that's going to tell us what the social and political world will be like. For Rousseau, our essential goodness in some other sense, and it will reveal the evils of bureaucratically arranged society. Um, but you want to reject at the same time an overly quick gloss of Marx's criticism of this view, right? So he ends up saying that morality should be abolished in some sense, but clearly not in the sense of we should never think about moral questions. So what do you think Marx thinks human nature is, and why does it lead him to the path that you just explained, towards thinking about revolution and labor, rather than to the path that is perhaps more common in moral and political philosophy, like say a social contract, as it leads Locke and Rousseau towards thinking?
Yeah, great. So the sort of gap metaphor, right, that I just gave, I actually use it less often than I used to, although I do use it in the book. And the reason why is that even though it is a useful metaphor, which is why why I ever use it, there's also a possibility of um, having too schematic a picture. So because strictly speaking, right, it's not actually that there's a gap per se between the world as it is and then the world as it should be, where the world as it should be can only be known through abstract reflection, sort of ideal conceptual reflection, right? Rather, and this goes to Marx's dialectics and his historical materialism. Rather, the more filled in picture is that the world as it should be already exists within the current one, right? That and so we get these claims from Marx like that. Um, Communism is not an ideal to which reality must adjust itself, but rather an already existing movement overcoming the current state of things. And because it is an already existing movement over throwing the current state of things, it is the kind of thing that we can know through empirical study, right? I mean, like so much of what's going on in Marx and Engels is based on attempting to understand historically how is it that working people have resisted capitalism? How is it that working people are resisting capitalism now? That is the primary sort of object of study for developing a view about the nature of capitalism itself and the likelihood of ever producing a different society, and also the desirability of socialism. Is something that I think, at least the way that I read Marx, is something that he is taking up from the already ongoing struggles of oppressed, poor, and working people battling against the ravages of capitalism and seeking their survival, and finding in practice and in theory that the survival of the mass of humanity on the planet requires that they resist capitalism and produce a different kind of society that is based on the fulfillment of human needs. Um, so, sorry, so you asked me about social contract theory and about the sort of, like the sort of ideals of freedom and individuality. Is that the kind of thing that you were like, why can't these ideals be satisfied there? Is that the
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm,
And the only other thing that I had appended to that is these concepts of revolution
mhm,
and labor. They involve like a really specific way of thinking of human activity, self-directed human activity. Like, how do we
Yeah.
get there rather than the social contract?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so it's with this, it's interesting with the social contract stuff. It's interesting because this is one of the places where Marx really sees himself um as, abolishing in the true German sense, right? Of like some real Aufhebung is going on, which is to say,
So
he
much
both
Aufhebung.
so much Aufhebung, which is to say he means to supersede the capitalist philosophies of the time, right? But he also sees himself as preserving what is in fact genuinely progressive and even revolutionary in those traditions, right? So the ideals of individuality, of freedom, um it's not a bad thing, right, that liberalism sort of champions and promotes those as ideals. It's why they decamped to England and when they did, because over there was free speech and they weren't being thrown into jail and so like so there's this um on the one hand, there is a real veneration, right, for some of the kind of at least ostensibly uh liberationist aspirations of liberalism, but then recognition that liberalism and social contractarianism and a capitalist democracy is highly limited in its capacity to actually bring about and realize the fulfillment of these ideals that are presented as virtues. And so part the exchange in the manifesto where Marx is responding to this imagined bourgeois interlocutor who's saying, well, you don't seem to care about freedom and individuality and the family and so on. And Marx points out that while these things are held up as virtues, in fact, um, people aren't free, right? And they're not able to express their individuality. The family that bourgeois society extols is already destroyed by the demands of the workplace, and this is Victorian England, so even your 7-year-old is at the factory, right? So it's like, what are we talking about? But then holds out the possibility of a kind of, truly fully realized freedom and individuality and even family, but a family of real generalized universal human solidarity and recognition. Um, but oh, sorry, that there was there's one piece of your question that I've forgotten, I think.
Labor.
Labor, yeah. So labor, Marx, sometimes in Capital, he calls it human self-changing. In other places, he actually also in Capital, he talks about the worker relating to the natural world, and so that the world itself becomes an extension of the laborer's body. And Marx talks at times about this kind of metabolism between the laborer and the external world. The essence for human beings, what the sort of the fundamental essential activity of human life, what it is to be a human, or as Marx and Engels put it in the critique of the German ideology, how human beings distinguish themselves, right, from other non-human animals, is precisely in the robustness of this capacity for trans for rational, conscious, goal-directed transformation of themselves, right? So that human beings are their own creative the product of their own creation. Now that's already true. It's the basis of the materialist conception of history, just is the recognition that if you want to understand something about human life, you have to do history. You have to understand how it is that that thing has come to be as a result of human beings interacting with their natural and social world. And that goes not just for things like capitalism itself, but also for things that we might consider natural, ineradicable, and essential, like human beings are greedy, human beings are competitive, human beings are racist, they're sexist, right? We come to see that actually there is a history for each of those things I just named, and that we can learn that history by asking the question, how is it that human beings have produced themselves as this, right? How is it that human beings have produced this feature of human social being? And um the project of revolutionary change, right, just is the project um of passing out of our prehistory, which Marx thinks we are still in, right, the prehistory of producing our own reality, our own social world, but not knowing that that's what we're doing, right, relating to it as though it is just given, sort of naturally given, and not relating to it as though it is something that we ourselves have brought into being and could bring into a different way of being. And which is just revolution, right? It is just the species taking up its own existence as its creative project and choosing to realize itself in full.
It's a great note to end on.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Vanessa and Femi, for that brilliant discussion. So we have some questions from people in the audience already. For anyone else who's tuned in live, please do continue to add your questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So the first question I'll pose to you is from Alyosha. And Alyosha is asking about your departures, Vanessa, from previous interpretations of Marx, and specifically Cornel West's 1992 work, The Ethical Dimension of Marxist Thought. So how does Professor Wills see her work aligning or departing with West's own take on ethics and Marxism?
Yeah, great. So in that book, West puts forward a sort of historicist reading of Marx on ethics, where the dimensions of morality or the demands of morality even sort of shift with historical changes and developments. There's something very appealing about that reading, and I actually mention it in the introduction of this book, right, as something that, there's a kind of I mean, there's a kind of correctness, right? Of the notion that historical changes then have bearing on what is morally correct at any particular moment in time. I think that is quite reasonable to think. Where I depart from West is in reading Marx as not also having, in addition to that kind of historicist perspective of morality, something that really underscore, like, what we might consider a kind of transhistorical principle, right? And it is that operates in addition with that one. And the transhistorical principle there, for me, is the development of human capacities, right? The sort of realization of the labor process as something that we have engaged in unwittingly, unconsciously, unaware of that that's what we're doing, but that the sort of self-consciousness of labor is in fact a key part of what it is that we are striving for, right, and attempting to bring about. So there's some, as I say, there's some aspects of West reading that I find quite plausible, right? But the role of labor, right, is playing a kind of role for me that it doesn't play for West in that book.
Great. The next question is from Gail, and Femi, do join in and add anything in response to these questions. So the question from Gail is, can you comment on Marx's idea in Capital on the fetishism of commodities? A very important idea for me as a museologist.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is, I mean, it's one of the places that I look when I shake my head in wonder, as I often do, at the prevalence of the view that Marx abandons the concept of alienation. Because I take it that the whole point of the story of like the story that we're told in Capital about commodity fetishism is that we exist in a world where it looks as though the commodities do all kinds of things, and it looks as though economic life is sort of ticking along under its own power. But it turns out that actually what it is that we're seeing is our own alienated productivity, our own alienated activity. That is the, that just seems to be like the point, right, of the story, or of describing it as a kind of fetishism of commodities, which is precisely to suggest that the commodities are endowed in our theory and in our perception with power that they don't actually have, but that is just our own externalized and our own externalized power that is turned against us precisely because we aren't aware that this has happened, and precisely because we produce in a way that reliably creates this kind of inverted relationship between us and our own products and productive activity. So I mean, I hope that's helpful. It's sort of a short answer, but yeah, I mean, I see it as really importantly part and parcel of the conception of alienation that I think is important for Marx all throughout his work.
And maybe the flip side of the other point that you were making about the possibility of a revolution, right? If we were to change society, we might end up in a society where we're actually doing what we're doing, right? Where we actually know what corn is and what makes corn valuable,
Right.
and actually, produce corn out of a recognition of that. That would be part of what it is to produce corn on purpose, as opposed to
Yes.
what we have structurally now under capitalism, where corn comes to mean some alien weird thing because of the circulation of commodities.
Yes, absolutely. This comes up also in some of my discussions of utilitarianism in the book, and Marx's criticisms of utilitarianism. And I cite some of Ruth Groff's work, which is where she very often is highlighting sort of Humean empiricism as sorry, but just like alienation par excellence, right? With this with this sort of hollowed out the sort of like the hollowed out character of the commodity as such, which you're raising, Femi, like the notion that I just relate to it as a commodity. It's just something to buy and sell, rather than as I think we would if we ever are to develop the thing that Marx sometimes calls the human sense, right? Is of like actually, like exactly, actually being like fully recognizing what things in the world are, whether it's corn or linen or flax or a human being, you know, sort of like actually being able to apprehend the world, and see things, you know, as they really are. I mean, this is the piece where Marx's aspirations for fully realized human existence are, you know, loop back to some of the initial questions that animate him, I think, including what makes scientific knowledge of the world possible. And we have to remember that Marx is developing out of a German idealist fascination with the question of science and scientificity itself, right? And so much of I mean, one way to think about the problem of alienation, or you know, the problem of commodity fetishism, you know, just is that we are relating to the world in a way that's mediated by these obscuring and alienating and abstract relations. And what happens if I just have an immediate relationship to the world? And this is the thing that he thinks labor can get us at, this sort, you know, this constantly attending to the world while in an active interrelation with the world. That's how it is that we can have an accurate, objective account of what's around us and who's around us.
Great. So the next question is from Gregory, who says, would you elaborate on the standpoint theoretical distinction between bourgeois morality or ethics versus proletariat or communist morality, and the historicity of morality?
Yeah, I'll try. I'll start. That's a great question. And I'll, yeah, anyway, so I'll start saying things. I probably won't say enough to sort of answer the question as fully as it deserves. But so in the book, when I talk about a bourgeois perspective or a proletarian perspective, I think most often I render that in fairly thin terms. So a bourgeois perspective I talk about as a perspective that that takes it that the bourgeoisie is the class that is most well suited to lead humanity, that it is the class that is in the best position to solve the problems that face humanity and to safeguard our future. And a proletarian perspective is one that holds that it is the working class that, as Marx puts it in the manifesto, has the future in its hands, right? That it is the class that is best suited to lead humanity, and therefore, you know, also the class with the best and clearest perspective on humanity. But as I say, that's a very thin sort of way of rendering it and spelling it out. You know, I towards the end of the book, I talk about, I think at the very end of chapter 9, I talk about it in more sort of poetic terms, right? And I say that the proletarian perspective that Marx is advocating is one that is a view of the world as it appears while we are in the process of trying to change it, while we, you know, the sort of approaching the world from the point of view of labor just is, right? Approaching the world from the point of view of attempting to transform it in such a way as to better satisfy human needs. And that is a view of the world in motion, and in a kind of motion that is set into place by human agency and human subjectivity. That is a view of the world as the sort of thing that can change, right? That is susceptible to transformation. And it's a view of the world as something that has been produced through previous human transformation. Think about in terms of standpoint. I mean, the last thing that I at least want to make sure to get into this answer is that it is completely possible and coherent for even a capitalist like Engels, for example, right, to adopt the kind of standpoint from the point of view of labor that Marx is describing. And as we know, it's not only possible, but quite actual for working people to have a bourgeois perspective, right, and bourgeois point of view. So as a kind of question of standpoint, it's not imputing a certain perspective to every actually existing member of the working class or every actually existing member of the capitalist class, but it is imputing a perspective that that belongs to the position of a class as a whole with respect to the work of producing and reproducing society. And so the perspective from the point of view of labor is supposed to be potentially emancipating and clarifying, precisely because it is the standpoint from the point of view of that portion of society that is engaged in the everyday work of actually doing the things that sustain this society and make it the society that it is, and could potentially make it a better one.
So the next question is from Jacqueline Frost, who asks, how do you work against or refute the anti-humanism of so much contemporary Marxism and critical theory, and thinking here of Latourianisms as well as decolonial idealisms?
It's a great question. I don't think I do. I don't think I try. I think I just try to sort of so I don't take up those perspectives by name sort of explicitly in the book. The book is very much rooted in that thinking Marx model and trying to get clear on Marx's views, although of course I'm in conversation throughout the book with many other interpreters of Marx. But so the book doesn't have a direct kind of confrontation with that perspective, but it is itself a resolutely humanist book. And the places where I probably have the most in the way of a specific treatment of that is maybe um, some of Marx's critiques of Christian morality, and even potential charges one might make against an ethical story that is so grounded in the well-being of humans, right, specifically. And I think that, so at the end of the day, I write in the book, and I think this would be true for Marx as well. Like it assumes of the reader. This book absolutely assumes of the reader that they take some interest in the survival of humanity. And if for the reader who wants to know why they should care about human survival, I have to confess that I have nothing to offer. I have nothing to offer because the book takes for granted a reader who wants humans to make it. And the reason why, so there's lots of reasons why I don't have anything to say really to the sort of the sort of like doggedly anti-humanist person, or why I don't even really try to talk to them, right? Is I think, you know, Marxist theory in general, Marxism in general, right, is an attempt to theorize, is itself an attempt to theorize the world from a radically human perspective, and to draw well, when we come back to that question of the knowability of the world or the limits and possibilities of science, right? They come, one of the places they come from is a concern that we can't escape our sort of human subjectivity, and that the only kind of perspective we can have on the world is one that is shaped in all sorts of ways by the vicissitudes and idiosyncrasies of being human. But you know, that's just true. I just don't, you know, I don't I don't attempt to supersede or sort of move beyond or transcend that human perspective on the world and on one another. So now you know, what can the book offer some, you know, if you find yourself in an argument with someone who has a very anti-humanist kind of perspective, maybe, I mean, I think what the book has to offer then is, you know, I like to think a highly coherent, well-constructed, well-argued defense of humanism as, you know, as a coherent uh vantage point on which to view the world and on which to say sensible things about the world and about the knowability of the world and about our potential to transform the world. I don't have an argument for why someone should care about what happens to humanity, aside from the argument that that I think that any of us who wishes to, for ourselves to survive, right, you know, or for future generations, even rather nearby ones, to survive, that none of that can happen without taking up human survival in general as our aim. And this is, again, what is for Marx distinctive about working people is that the masses of working, oppressed, and poor and exploited people on the globe cannot safeguard their own survival without working for human survival in general. So, but I do take human survival as a unqualified good as a human person, and I really don't you know, I don't have anything to offer anyone who's confused about that other than a hug, maybe.
So I think we have time for just one more question, and maybe both Vanessa and Femi could speak to this as a way of having the last word. This is from Su Ming Ku, who says, "Thank you for this interesting conversation, especially the discussion of historicism. Can you discuss a little bit what we should say about Marx's ethical view on emancipation?"
Just a little bit, you know, because I think emancipation is, I mean, we could use that concept. The whole book could have been for emancipation, would have been like a equally sort of good title, because you know, what it is that I think Marx is advocating is precisely that human beings intervene into their historical social development to emancipate themselves from shackles of their own making, that in taking up the possibility of unleashing, unfettering their own creative potential, their own productive capacities, that this is a project of freedom, right? Of really making human beings free, that what it is for human beings to develop a society that makes it the case that they can appear in reality in a way that corresponds with their essence as productive, as rationally productive beings who create their own conditions of existence. Another way to describe that just is, I think, the project of emancipation. And we saw Marx himself in his own time. I mean, so one thing that I've come to realize people are not don't all know is that Marx wrote, open letters during the American Civil War, that he wrote open letters to Abraham Lincoln and to the American white working class, as we call it, and arguing for the importance of emancipation of chattel slaves. So Marx himself, I saw, a number of cases of political emancipation. We see this, you see him talking about this issue in on the Jewish question as well, right? The importance of supporting political emancipation as a larger project of advancing human emancipation generally.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, Marx spent, I don't remember exactly how many years, but something like a decade working as a journalist for an abolitionist newspaper in the US. And often when people try to, play up Marx's bona fides on this question, they often quote that kind of stray comment he makes in Capital: labor could not emancipate itself in a white skin so long as it was branded in a black skin. And I think today in the 21st century, that's kind of read as just a sort of statement of progressivism, like chattel slavery is bad, and also, wage slavery is bad. And certainly Marx would have thought that. But I think the broader thing that Marx actually thought, and the point that he's actually making in that section of Capital where he says this, is just the point that Professor Wills has been making, right? There is a view underneath this entire theory of what it is to be deeply free, of what it is to live in a historical system and set of conditions that is compatible with freedom, and that is compatible with owning yourself, owning your labor, not in the sense that you own it as an object to sell, but in the sense that it is genuinely yours. And that view is what lies on the other side of revolution for Marx. That view of freedom, that view of non-alienation, that view of being a real participant in your own history. And if there is a view that it accounts for why this way of thinking has been taken up by so many political movements and been treated with the level of seriousness that it has, and countless national independence movements and anti-colonial movements and so on and so forth, I think it's that one. I think that's what people are responding to at the bottom of this, whatever we might quibble about how to read his critique of Aristotle or Locke or Rousseau. I think this is the core view. This is the kernel of truth and inspiration at the bottom of this that we can hang our hats on.